Michael, I think, but I'm not sure, that was an invitation to give you a 2-hour lecture tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. on the subtleties of Medicare Part B. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next participants on the panel. And what a pleasure it is to introduce one of my most favorite presidents. Recently, I referred to President Clinton as the best post-president in American history. And someone asked, well, Pete, what about George Washington? I replied, actually, I knew George well. But when it came to post-presidents, George Washington is no Bill Clinton. Seriously, one of my joys of recent times is the opportunity to partner with President Clinton and the Clinton Foundation, to attend the annual meeting of his foundation, as I have done, and see the breadth and depth of the foundation's agenda, and more to the point, the President's extraordinary grasp of every project is truly a unique experience. And now at this, of all conferences, how could I fail to mention the masterful handling of the fiscal challenges of the 1990s and end up with impressive growth and 4 balanced budgets and even budget surpluses. Mr. President, we are so honored to have you appeared, that you've appeared at each of our summits. And who better to interview you than a titan of politics, than a titan of journalism? Tom Brokaw is one of the most respected voices in America. In 5 decades as a reporter, it also includes 21 years as anchor of NBC Nightly News. He's interviewed every president since LBJ, and he helped shine a light on America's greatest generation. And speaking of generations, I consider Tom the Walter Cronkite of his generation. Tom, I'm sometimes a bit defensive about being born and brought up in Kearney, Nebraska, a population of 9,000. That is, I was defensive until I discovered yesterday that you were brought up in Webster, South Dakota, a population of 2,000. So, ladies and gentlemen, President Bill Clinton and Tom Brokaw, welcome.
Thanks, Pedro. Thank you very much. Mr. President, I think you're here.
I'm supposed to sit on your left?
I don't often get to give orders to Commander-in-Chief, so I'm very happy to be able to do that. First of all, I'm very pleased to be here for what I think is one of the most compelling issues of my lifetime as a political journalist, and I think it's going to be a defining issue not just for the rest of this election cycle, but for a long time to come. And I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to interview President Clinton, who paused in his world travels to come down here because he cares so deeply about the subject that brings us here today. I've just spent, Mr. President, the last 3 weeks, as we were talking backstage, going around America in a way. I was doing a series of town halls, Mid-Atlantic, Eastern Seaboard, the Midwest, Southwest, the Far West, and I detected a kind of uniform reaction to what's going on in this country. There's a mass of people out there that I would describe in the middle who are longing to be led, and this is across political identification, Republicans and Democrats and independents alike. If I were to characterize, I suppose, the tone of those audiences and the country, is there's a kind of weariness and wariness about the political system as it is now constituted, especially in this election year and given what we've been through this spring. And for the first time in my personal and professional life, I have parents and grandparents coming up to me and saying, I'm just worried that my children will not have the lives that we've had, my husband and I, or my wife and I. I'd never heard that before until this past year, and I've been trying to get the answer to that recalibrated in a way, saying maybe we ought to think about the quality of life that we're talking about here, more economic justice, for example, more tolerance in our society, and think about especially how we can raise the level of public service in America, get more people to step into the arena at a time when these hard decisions are going to have to be made. I offer that just as a kind of backdrop for the issues that bring you all here today, obviously, and that's fiscal responsibility, the impact of the deficit, and how we begin to work our way out of it. A year ago, you said it would be a mistake, Mr. President, to try to fix the deficit when the economy is so broken. Do you still feel that way?
Yes, but I also said I think we should pass a very tough deficit reduction plan now and provide for it to trigger when the economy has reached like 3% growth for a few quarters. Because I think it would do an enormous amount to deal with the problem you just mentioned. I mean, there's this gnawing sense. I remember in my last year as president, we had a horrible tornado that hit downtown Little Rock and destroyed a lot of the oldest neighborhoods. And so I went down to check it out, and then afterward, at the airport, I had a little barbecue dinner with 20 people I went to high school with. I think 2 of them had 4-year college degrees. Only 1 of them had ever made more than $50,000 or $60,000 in his life. And I just went around the table and I asked them what they were most worried about. And even then, they were most worried that the retirement of the baby boomers would undermine their children's ability to raise their grandchildren. So that's on steroids now because we've had this long recession. The economy was anemic before the crash in terrible sense, and because of the debt. So I favor, what I would like to see them do is to do what Simpson Bowles said. Simpson Bowles said, pass our plan. I'd like to even see them take more out of the deficit more quickly than Simpson Bowles, but they said pass our plan, but trigger it when there is clearly growth, because you won't have to convince anybody to do it then, because as soon as there's real growth back in this economy with all this public debt out here that has to be financed, interest rates will go through the roof. The cost of financing the deficit will be staggering, and the private sector will be screaming for affordable credit. So, but if we did it now, people would see that we're a serious country, and the American people would feel reassured about it, and the Europeans might have a way out of the box they have gotten themselves in. You see with both the EU and all these recent elections and the UK, if you impose austerity when interest rates are zero and private demand is virtually non-existent, then what will happen is revenues will drop more than you can cut spending. And if I was really impressed, actually, after these last elections, that while the political leaders themselves seemed intransigent, ordinary Greek citizens would say things like, we know we had to cut these pension benefits, we know everybody's got to start paying taxes, we know we've got to do some things here, but we'd like to see the benefits of it. So that's what I think. I think we should pass a plan as soon as possible, but do what Simpson Bowles said, trigger it when certain growth projections are met. And you won't have to convince anybody because interest rates will start to rise dramatically.
But the chances of getting anything done before the election are slim and none.
Probably, but I think that, I think that the 2 plans ought to be talked about more, or the however many plans there are out there. The president, I think, should talk more about the Medicare savings he has proposed, and the defense cuts he has proposed, and the fact that he proposes, and this, I disagree with this, by the way, he proposes to take discretionary non-defense spending to its lowest percentage of GDP since President Eisenhower was in office. That's our future budget. And I think both the Republicans and the Democrats, in arguing over their ideological positions, short out the future budget and basically put really poor and vulnerable people in a tough bind. So, but we ought to be talking about this stuff. If he has at least tried to honor the deal he made with the Republicans, and I think he should talk more about it, and I think they should talk more about it. The gentleman that just defeated Senator Lugar, said something that I found disturbing, although I kind of liked him personally. He's a very appealing sort of person. But he said, I am totally against any compromise. Our worldviews are irreconcilable, and we just have to keep fighting until somebody wins it all. And if that were the view, there never would have been a Constitution, there never would have been a Bill of Rights, the capital would have never been moved to Washington, D.C., the federal government would not have assumed the debts of the colonies from the Revolutionary War, and nothing else would have happened. But so I think but as soon as this election's over, I think the incentives will be for both parties to make more principled compromise than they have in the past.
Let me just add to the context, if I can. This is the page from the current Economist, the Lexington section, and they often, from the United Kingdom, have a more clear-eyed view of what we're going through here. 4 recent surveys have found that on average only 28% of Americans are satisfied with the condition of the country. 70% are dissatisfied. 3 recent surveys have found that between 69% and 83% of the Americans believe the country is still in a recession, even though it is not. Yet anyone who prefers a glass half full can find grounds for optimism. The first Boeing 787 Dreamliner has just landed in Washington. It will be decades before China can make such a machine. The IMF is predicting average growth of over 2% for 2012 and 2013. This country still has the world's best universities, more than any other. It is the world's largest producer of natural gas and its biggest food exporter. Granted, this is a government of fits and starts, hobbled by the whims of voters. But if we don't do something, we're going to end up with sequester at the end of the year, in which the spending cuts will be automatic. What do you think the chances are that sequester will be activated?
I don't know. My guess is that they'll avoid it after the election. But I agree with what the economist said about the strengths of the American economy, and they left out the fact that it's a very diverse and a global economy. It's a good thing we got somebody here from everywhere else, and a lot of this anti-immigration fervor seems to be abating. I also agree that most people think we're still in a recession because nobody's gotten a pay raise in so long. Keep in mind, even before the financial crash on September 15th, 2008, inflation-adjusted median income was $2,000 lower than it was the day I left office because we produced so few jobs. And because small business people were spending all their profits that they would have given pay raises on paying for health care premiums. So I think that the perception is real. People don't feel more secure about their own financial future.
But at the same time, the positions have hardened politically. We're seeing that in Wisconsin with the recall movement, for example. You're seeing it as well in Ohio, where John Kasich came in, made some pretty big bold moves and had his head handed to him not too long after that. Certainly around the world, in France, the election of a socialist movement, a rejection of austerity. Greece is in utter turmoil at this time. Even Great Britain has had that. We seem to be moving to more deeper and deeper into the extreme poles and leaving out the mass of the people. How can you activate that group that does want to do the responsible thing? Should there be some kind of an extraordinary coalition that goes beyond Simpson Bowles, that becomes a political movement in this election year and says, in effect, we're linking arms and saying to these two candidates, we want something done that is realistic and we want it done urgently?
Well, it'd be great if they could do it, but the evidence is that the Republicans will be scared to do it after what happened to Senator Lugar, although there were other factors in his defeat. And we'll have to see how there's 2 or 3 other primaries planned out now, and we'll see what happens. But obviously, I think there should be a big bipartisan coalition for this. We may just have to wait till the election's over. The American people are going to have to decide. One of the things is that, you know, they go around telling everybody how sorry these politicians are, and they voted for all of them. And one of the problems is we listen to the rhetoric of politicians, and we pay almost no attention to their specifics. I feel sort of sorry for what's the Tea Party Congress down the House, down to 18% approval or something like that. They must be bewildered. All they're doing is what they promised to do when they won that overwhelming victory. it's not like they didn't tell everybody what they were going to do. But we we talk about the body language and the likability and the strength and all that and what's their slogan. Actually, most people you vote for actually try to do what they say they're going to do when they're running. So the American people have got to take some ownership here too. Meanwhile, I think the politicians ought to be talking more about the hard issues. I think this budget issue ought to become front and center in the presidential election, in all the debates, in very specific ways.
I think the opening question of the first presidential debate should be, which of the two of you will activate Simpson Bowles if you're put in the White House?
Could be. But Obama will say, I thought they were a little excessive on defense cuts. My defense cuts are only slightly smaller, but I've actually cut more in the first 5 years in Medicare spending than they recommended. And then you'll have to go back and say, yeah, but you hadn't done anything about Social Security. Simpson Bowles actually makes the Social Security system more progressive. That's one thing I love about it. I would have to pay more or give mine up or whatever, but that would help if you ask the right follow-up. If you ask, okay, here's what they said about X, what's your position on X? In other words, you got to get down to basically the Republicans compared to Simpson Bowles want too much for tax cuts, not just making the Bush tax cut permanent, but making more tax cuts. And the Democrats are reluctant to commit to the longer-term health care savings and don't yet want to touch Social Security, which I think can be fixed with relatively little controversy, and in a way that would, if you look at the Simpson Bowles plans, it's very clever. It actually is better for lower-income seniors than the current system.
Let's talk political strategy, if we can, for a moment. I know it's a subject that's near and dear to your heart. If you're Mitt Romney and you've emerged from this trial by fire in the Republican primaries, in which you've had to hew very closely to the very conservative wing of the party, how do you begin to transform yourself coming out of this convention so that you can play much more to the middle and deal with these issues that may include, in fact, as Simpson Bowles does, some tax increases?
I don't know. It's really hard. I mean, a moderate Republican friend of mine in New York, who was going to vote for Romney, by the way, said, gosh, you know, he said, that Etch-a-Sketch guy, he said, they ought to give him a promotion. He told the truth. He said, it's like Romney said, I'm running for the president of the student body of this extreme right-wing group, and the real argument was that I couldn't be their president because I wasn't right-wing enough, so I had to get over there and pretend that I was. Now, let me tell you what I'm really going to do as president. It's tough, but I think he's going to have to fill it out. For example, the budget he put out in the primary, according to a lot of independent sources, would actually increase the debt over and above what's going to happen by $1 trillion or more, whereas the budget that President Obama's put out, according to the Congressional Budget Office, would take about 3% of GDP out of our annual deficit and take it down to 77% the debt held by the public and stabilize it there. I think it's too much. I'd like to see them take it down more, but I think you have to have some growth figures that can reasonably figure it in to get much lower than that. But I think he has to start with specifics. And he could say, look, I've got to deal with Republicans and Democrats. We've got to do this together. And, but he's hung with the budget he came out with in the primary, which said that the Bush tax cuts weren't enough. He wanted to cut even more on the job creators after 10 years when we've had no jobs. So I think it's a difficult thing. I don't know how he's going to do it. And he had to announce his own health care bill as a solution for the national average. I'll tell you an interesting thing about that. Massachusetts has expensive health care. It's 7th highest in the country. Before Romney signed the health care bill with the individual mandate, it was the 2nd most expensive health care in the country. In other words, since it was signed, inflation in health care costs in Massachusetts has been substantially lower than in the country as a whole because they took a lot of sand out of the gears, a lot of the cost shifting and paperwork associated with large numbers of uninsured people. It would be a good thing if he can embrace that again, but I don't know how he can. Or at least, you know, he ought to have some incentives for a, this depends in part on what the Supreme Court does, but it depends. This is, from the point of view of the budget, I think the biggest item. That is, there's a recession component to this huge deficit in our debt, where at worst case you had spending at 24% of GDP and revenues at barely above 15. So if you had, let's say, 3% growth for a couple of years, it would probably correct to 21% in 17. When I was president, we had the balanced budget. We had revenues at somewhere around 20 to a little over 19, and spending was always a little under 19 down to close to 18. So we had 4 surplus budgets in a row, 2 of them without any of the Social Security Trust Fund. So what you really need is a plan that closes the structural deficit, knowing that the rest of it will be closed or not if you have growth. And maybe Romney can just come out with a new plan based on what I would say is the Congressional Budget Office says these numbers don't add up. I don't agree with him because I think you always get more revenues when you cut taxes, notwithstanding 30 years of evidence to the contrary. And so here's my new plan. But it's a very big challenge for him, a very big challenge. I feel a lot of sympathy for him because the whole primary was about trying to find somebody that was a true conservative. And so, but they're going to vote for him anyway, those people, I think, because they think he's more conservative than President Obama, which he clearly is. So if I were in his position, I would, I think, use the Congressional Budget Office numbers saying my deficit, my plan, increase the debt, and say that, you know, no responsible president can pretend that an independent analysis of his numbers don't matter. That's, I think, his best avenue back into the real world.
Do you think it's possible for him to enlist and activate the moderate Republicans like your friend in New York who's going to vote for him and put together a group around the country that can make a big public statement about what is necessary, A, to get him elected and get the country back on the right track, or in both cases, both parties been taken over by the more dogmatic sets on the left and the right?
For one thing, you know, that's just not true. There have been 2 different independent analyses in the last couple of months about this, and they said if you believe there was a center, let's say in my second term, that in the Senate, the Republicans have moved 3 times as far away from that center as the Democrats have, but in the House they moved 12 times as far away from that center as the Democrats have. Now, I'm not saying my party's not blameless. We got to do something about health care and Social Security in our budget, whatever happens on taxes, in order to free up some investment in the future, the key to our growth. I think there ought to be corporate tax reform, for example, tied to funding this infrastructure bank with the public-private partnership, because you get a good return on investment on it, and we're about the only major country in the world that doesn't use private capital with public capital to modernize infrastructure. But I think that, you know, the Republican position that tends to prevail in these hot primaries was expressed by the gentleman who beat Senator Lugar, who says, I'm just against compromise. We need to stop it. It's weak. It's foolish. Our views are irreconcilable. We have to force the American people to choose which one of us is right. If that prevails, we're toast. We'll look like a Bush League country because one party, our party, the Democrats, will look like we're hanging on to the status quo of, well, our budget will be we can balance it better than they can, but it'll be so much on the baby boom generation and on healthcare delivery systems that haven't been modernized that we will be holding on to the past too much, and their budget will be in la-la land because it will defy arithmetic. And it will just say, if, you know, just cut every millionaire's tax like Bill Clinton to 0, 1,000 flowers would bloom, in spite of the fact that they never produce as many jobs with that as we do with a more balanced approach where you invest and balance and try to grow.
Let's talk about politics about this in a more specific way, if we can, for a moment. Wisconsin. It's going to be one of the milestones of this year, what happens with the recall effort, money pouring in from both sides. What would have happened when the governor took such a hard position on the unions and when he said we're not going to have collective bargaining anymore for the public unions? What would have happened if those unions had said in a kind of grieved voice, Governor, we just want to come sit at the table with you and work all of this out. We're not going to just gather outside the Capitol. We're not going to start a recall, but invite us in. This is our future as well as yours. This is our state as well as yours. We stand on the steps of the Capitol wanting to come in to the inner chamber, sit down with you, and negotiate this in a way that has traditionally been done in this country. Would that have been a better strategy for the unions?
It might have been a better strategy, but I think they would have wound up in the same place because he was elected on a promise to break them. And the people voted for him. They voted for him thinking that Obama and the Democrats had given him, well, this is like 94 all over again, that 2010 election. The basic thought is that American people really have been conditioned to believe government would screw up a two-car parade. And they have always been skeptical of it, and then it's become part of the orthodoxy of the right since the mid-1970s. So they probably should have done that and said, here's what we offer in terms of concessions, because they had some long-term problems, although the Wisconsin problems were not all that severe. And the voters voted for this guy because they thought, well, the Democrats are giving us a little too much government, we need to rein them in. But they didn't pay attention to the specific things. The governor's just doing what he promised to do. But again, voters often vote on the thematics and the direction, and they think we're all a bunch of slugs who don't care about our commitments. Overwhelmingly, people running for executive office actually try to do what they say they're going to do. And increasingly, since Newt Gingrich proved you could nationalize a midterm election, people running for Congress try to do the specific things they promised to do, on the assumption that the voters actually ratified that course by electing them. So I think, you know, frankly, they just decided that they had rolled over and played dead long enough and that somebody needed to beat them, since they got beat by an extremist rhetorical campaign. So they said, the Republicans have taught us that the harder you are and the more extreme you are and the more demonizing you are of your opposition, the more likely you are to win elections. I mean, and if you're reasonable and everything, they eat you alive in the primary and in the general. People think you're weak or wishy-washy or whatever. They don't know what the heck you stand for. So I think tactically they should have offered that first, plus what they were willing to accept, but I doubt if it would have worked. Not because, look, after 2010, everybody drank the Kool-Aid. They thought, oh, the American people's with us on everything. They're with us on everything. How else could we have won all these elections with these things we said? And, you know, they did all that. The liberals thought Obama wasn't liberal enough, and the conservatives said, you know, he wasn't American enough. Bob Inglis got beat in a Republican primary, let me remind you, in South Carolina with a 100% conservative voting record on 2 issues. After his injury, he said he had an epiphany and he realized that he didn't have to hate the president to oppose him. That he was an American, not a Kenyan, a Christian, not a Muslim. As near as he could see, he was a good family man, and he liked him. He just thought he was wrong about everything. That was a cardinal sin. And the other thing was, he said, I listened to my Senator Lindsey Graham and John McCain, and I think global warming is real. We need to do something about it. We just need a conservative, market-based solution to bring down greenhouse gases. That violated the theology, and they threw him out in a Republican primary. This guy was on the Judiciary Committee that impeached me, and it wasn't enough for him anymore. He's a very good guy, by the way. But I like him, but it's like it was never enough. Now, and guys like you always act like, well, if there's an impasse, it must be everybody's fault. There must be both parties at fault. Our party's problem is we are always reluctant to give up the gains of the past to create the future. That's a different problem. But we have a lot of people in our party who will not be drummed out if they depart from the conventional wisdom. And I think you could put together sufficient Democratic votes to enact some variation of Simpson Bowles, or maybe even to do more. But the numbers have to add up, and it can't just be an ideological food fight. So if that's really what the American people want, they have to make that clear. And I don't know how they're going to make it clear before the election.
Is there something to be learned in how you were successful in getting welfare reform through parts of your party that were so reluctant to embrace that?
Yeah. But you got to understand, most people don't know what happened in welfare reform. Most people don't know what it did. But I had already given 44 of the 50 states waivers to enact welfare reform before the law ever passed. And then the Republicans wanted to use welfare reform to cut benefits for legal immigrants and to basically block grant food stamps and Medicaid, health care and nutrition for poor kids. So I vetoed the first two bills because they block granted food stamps and Medicaid. And in the third bill, they got off of that, and I ate the cuts in benefits to legal immigrants in return for getting a lot more money for transportation, housing, and job training for people on welfare. There was, by 1996, people said, well, I got rid of the federal welfare benefit. Let me tell you what the federal welfare benefit was in 1996. It was that no state could pay a family of 3 or 4 less than they were paying them in 1973, 23 years earlier. So this alleged federal benefit went from a low of $187 a month in Mississippi and Texas to a high of $655 a month in Vermont. What we did to try to offset what has now happened in this recession was to say that every state would receive an amount of money for this equal to what they were getting in February of '94, which was the all-time high in federal reimbursement. And what I did not foresee is that after I left, the states would be allowed to spend this money on non-welfare things, and so the guarantee faded away, which is why the safety net didn't hold up as well. The other thing that was wrong with the welfare reform law was there was a 5-year lifetime limit. That should have told or stopped, if you will, whenever there was a recession. That is, whenever there was more than 6 months of negative growth. If we'd stopped that and we had harder requirements that required that money to be spent on preparing poor people to go into the workforce, I think it would have worked better. In the mild recession of 2001, people that moved from welfare to work were actually less likely than employees overall to be laid off. So, but when we worked through all this, and it took 2 vetoes, but that was part of the process. They wanted it, I wanted it, and they knew that we were doing it because 44 states had already been given waivers to do essentially the same thing.
Mr. President, we have a Facebook page, you'll not be surprised to hear, as part of this symposium that Pete Peterson has organized for us. Pete has always been on the cutting edge of technology. I mean, I can just see him twittering all night long. This is from Linda Knowlton in Fort Collins, Colorado. I'm a registered independent. I believe that we must raise taxes and make radical cuts to entitlements in order to ensure that my daughter and her friends won't have a lower quality of life because of our borrowing excesses. How on earth do you get the Democrats to agree to the entitlement cuts and the Republicans to admit that taxes must go up and not just for the rich? This is some of what we've been talking about here, but this is the essence of what a lot of people out there in the middle feel.
Well, I think, first of all, I think you ask people to actually read what Simpson Bowles did on Social Security. You should read it. I've read every word of the Simpson Bowles report. If you haven't read it, you should read it. And On the corporate tax reform thing, for example, I agree with what they did. They would raise slightly more money by flattening rates. The one thing they want to do that I disagree with is get rid of the R&D tax credit. I think that's a mistake. We're already 17th in the world in the generosity of our research and development tax credit, and we're trying to get high-end manufacturing back to America. We're getting a lot of it, and manufacturers increasingly like to have R&D done at the site where they do manufacturing. But otherwise, I think, you know, those two things are good. On the Medicare entitlement, you have two problems there. One is demographic. If the baby boomers consume health care at the same percentage of GDP our kids did, our parents did, we're sticking to our kids. About, I would say, $200 billion of the $1 trillion difference in what we pay under our system than we would pay if we had any other advanced country system is because of diabetes and other lifestyle-related things that older people and children do. So we have to deal with that. I think the Democrats, I think, could be induced to do some of that, to actually make changes in the law and the distribution system of food and what's being done in the schools. You already see a little of that would deal with that. About $500 billion of the difference is because we still pay for procedure and not for performance. But one of the reasons I don't want this health care bill to be repealed is at least it has the germ in it of these accountable care organizations which are paying for performance and not for procedure. And there are lots of them around the country now that have far lower inflation than overall. Then about $30 billion of the difference is because of the way we finance health care with huge paperwork costs and cost shifting, which will be diminished under this new system. You know, we've already had $1.3 billion in healthcare premiums returned this year under the 85% rule. So I think the Democrats should be willing to gamble that the ideas that are just floating around but not pushed through in this budget. The difference in the Obama plan and the one I passed is that mine had less government, but it did have a very hard health care budget because every other country in the world has one. And everybody said Bill Clinton's trying to ration health care. We ration health care every single day in America in millions of ways that we don't see. But the president, even with 60 votes to overcome the filibuster, couldn't get a budget through. I understood that, a budget cap. So I think that we could get the Democrats into this if they thought that they weren't going to be accused of putting the country at risk by taking defense reductions that are basically related to ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and shifting to more mobile forces like these special forces like the Navy SEALs that went after bin Laden. You know, there's a whole lot of effort now being exerted to training to figure out how we can deploy mobile forces even more quickly, where technology is going, and we don't need a Cold War military structure to do that. So I think if the Republicans showed a willingness to work with us on the defense cuts and some willingness to do something on revenues, I think we could get there. And I agree with the gentleman. You know, I don't think it would kill the country if we had growth to have the tax rates across. This is just me now. This is not, I'm not speaking for the White House, but I think you could tax me at 100% and you wouldn't balance the budget. We are all going to have to contribute to this, and if middle-class people's wages were growing up again and we had some growth in the economy, I don't think they would object to going back to the tax rates that obtained when I was president. The country did pretty well then, and very few people thought they were overtaxed because we had a growing income, tight labor markets, low inflation in health care, and rising wages. You got to put it all together to make it palatable. But again, I think that we can't be in a position where one of the negotiating partners says that's non-negotiable. Not only will we not raise taxes, we want the Bush tax cuts and we want more tax cuts, and we want the right to disregard what the Congressional Budget Office says that our budget will do to the bill. You can't do that. It's hard to have a deal if there's no arbiter. And I didn't always agree with what CBO said when I was president, but we had been through 12 years where the debt had gone up 4.5 times in the 12 years before I took office, and the government always had these rosy scenarios. So I instructed our Congressional Budget Office to try to always be at least as conservative as the Congressional Budget Office was, our OMB, I mean. And it worked out pretty well for us. But I think you could get there. I believe you could put together enough Democrats if you could make the simple argument that you simply cannot spend all your money on the present and the past. And we may have a better balanced budget plan than the Republicans do, or a better debt reduction plan, because the numbers add up, but it's still too heavily bogged down in health care and in retirement costs of the baby boom generation. So it's too oriented toward yesterday and today, and I don't think it's a good idea for us to have discretionary spending where it was when Eisenhower was president, when we're 15th in computer download speeds, and South Korea is 4 times faster than we are. I don't think it's, and I could give you I don't think it's a good idea when we've fallen in 12 years from 1st to 15th in the world in college graduation rates, when you can say whatever you want about whether people are getting their money's worth. The unemployment rate among college graduates is half what it is among people who don't have a college degree. I don't think it's a good idea to take it that low when we know if we retrain even middle-aged unemployed workers for jobs that will be available, which the Cleveland Clinic is doing with the community college in Cleveland on healthcare jobs that'll be there whatever happens to the healthcare. I don't think we ought to be gutting that. I think it will hurt us significantly with the economy over the long run. And it's a piddly little amount of money.
Erin Burnett is taking copious notes off stage because she's going to interview Speaker Boehner later this afternoon. So I think the president's helping her out some.
Don't make much of a fight, because we're doing something for Flight 93 tonight together, and I want him to speak to me at least on the stage.
Constituencies and their part and all, I had a little, not a dust-up actually, but a little exchange with the AARP when they had a commercial that ran at some length in December, I think, of last year, or maybe in late November, in which you may remember the kind of tough guy comes onto the screen and says, "Who am I?" And then they fill in behind him, "I'm the AARP. We need our benefits, and we want all these benefits, Medicare and Social Security," and it was kind of in your face. So I went on Meet the Press and said something about that. It seemed to me that there was a better way of dealing with that. You know, we have lots of people in the AARP who could probably afford, for example, Social Security is outlined in...
Absolutely. I think, look, if you live to be 65 in America today, for all of our life expectancy is not high compared to a lot of other countries. But if you get to be 65, you're in the oldest senior population on earth. And a lot of us are not poor. But half of the people 65 and over are kept out of poverty because of their Social Security payments. So the whole idea behind Simpson-Bowles is to ask people like you and me either to pay more or do with less, because we don't need it, so that we can bring the debt down and put a little more into the people on the low income of the scale. This is crazy. I saw Robert Samuelson had an article the other day saying that Roosevelt wouldn't recognize Social Security today because it has been, I mean, a third of the money goes to supplemental security income. I love that program. It does a lot of good, and it's targeted toward people who need it. But the rest of us are going to have to ask ourselves whether it wouldn't be better to have this means tested or income based in some way than any other change you could make. I mean, if you take Medicare, for example, the problem I have with the premium support argument, all the basically give a voucher and privatize it, is pretty straightforward. Medicare costs have gone up 400% a person in 40 years, and private health insurance has gone up 700%. In the last decade, private health insurance went up way more than Medicare and Medicaid did. So if you privatize it with a fixed voucher, you're giving people a fixed amount of money, putting them in a more expensive system, so there is no way that the whole population won't wind up either being poorer or sicker. It'll fix the budget problem. Just get Medicare off the budget. But it will fix the budget problem without the organic changes that we need in the healthcare system that would help the private sector even more than the budget. So I would rather see us show some restraint on increase the copays for people on Medicare, for example, who have more money to pay for it. And those of us who can afford it should pay for it, keep it as a backstop if we need it. You and I got our Medicare cards. But I favor that. We cannot, you just can't say we want it all just like it used to be. That's the problem in a lot of these European countries where they're asking for these accumulated pension liabilities to be ignored into the future. You know, for a very long time, when I was stunned when I became governor of Arkansas, which has a very conservative pension program. We were never underfunded. But some people were started drawing their pension at 50, and I said, how can this be justified? And they said, well, we never had any money, so these people never made good salaries, so we made it up to them by letting them retire early, draw a retirement, and then get another job so they could finally end their days with a decent income. A lot of this stuff made such good sense when these decisions are made, and they just don't work anymore because of the demographics. So I guess we're having a vigorous agreement on this. Yeah, if that's the AARP's position, I disagree with that.
Well, they called me and they changed. They took that ad down, and they have now more of a dialogue ad on there. I care about Social Security and what should I know about it.
The one thing you said that I agree with, by the way.
Only one?
No, but I mean the most important thing is that when you asked me the Wisconsin question, here's what I know. Most of my life has nothing to do with this today. I work in my foundation and I sell medicine in 70 countries. We're building health systems in 30 countries. We're doing agricultural and energy projects all over the world. And here's what I know. The places that work best are where all the stakeholders get together, openly acknowledge their different interests as well as their different ideas, and then talk to each other like they got half good sense. I mean, I was in Brazil last year in Manaus on the edge of the rainforest because they're really worried that after stopping 75% of the destruction of the rainforest under President Lula, it's ginning up again for two reasons. One is the sugar cane that they grow for ethanol, and they're the only country in the world that burns more ethanol than fuel. Doesn't use rainforest land, but it pushes the soybean farmers and the cattle ranchers into the rainforest. The other is they need more power, and they're 85% clean power, but it's all hydro, and the only places where the rivers run deep and hard enough to build new dams are in the rainforest. Here's the important thing. I go to this meeting. There's every electric company, every oil company, every big industry, the head of the chambers of commerce, the president of the Green Party, who ran third in the race for president, the representatives of the Native American tribes that are now constitutionally protected there, advocates for poor people, advocates for the environment, and they're all sitting around tables talking to each other like they're intelligent beings. In other words, to go back to what you said, you know, I don't have a vote in Congress. My opinion on the details is not as important as the process. And our politics favors conflict. And the only thing that is working anywhere in the world are creative networks of cooperation. That's why San Diego has the highest number of Nobel Prize-winning scientists in America, because they're the center of the human genome research. That's why Orlando has 100 computer simulation companies, because you got Defense, NASA, Disney World, Global Entertainment Arts, and the video game division of the Global Entertainment Arts, and the Universal theme park. They're all supporting this. So if you look at in America, around the world, getting all the stakeholders together with the goal of making an agreement. Doesn't ask anybody to change their mind, doesn't ask anybody to ignore their interests. It just says, in the end, a decision is better than an impasse. That may be more important than anything else in this whole thing. These people are plenty smart. There's lots of really smart people in Congress. And they can figure out how to do this, but their goal has to be to make a deal, not to have a fight.
I'll just share with you as we conclude here a couple of experiences that I've had recently that have worked pretty well. The President and I talk about these issues a lot personally. We've known each other a long time. I have the privilege of being on the Mayo Clinic board. It's a nonprofit board, and it's one of the most interesting things that I do. And I was in Phoenix recently, and they brought in a lot of people from the Phoenix area, most of whom I assumed were pretty conservative from a political point of view. And we walked them through the clinic that morning in Scottsdale, putting them in the labs and the ICU, and showed them a couple of the big operations that were going on. And then we all gathered for lunch. And I was going to stand up and talk to them about the place of the clinic in their lives and in the healthcare system in America. And I was trying to think of a way in which I could connect to them. And I said, when you saw those laboratory technicians, or you saw the nurse practitioners and the surgeons who were scrubbing for a very complicated operation, or you were with the medical unit, did you notice, did any of them ask, are you from a blue state or a red state? Did any of them say, are you a conservative or an independent, or are you a Tea Party member? They didn't ask that. I was in my home state of South Dakota the other night speaking to an organization out there that does a ranch for troubled boys. And again, in South Dakota, my guess is that most of the audience, big businessmen in Sioux Falls, doing very well out there, by the way. I said, you know, we all grew up in a state in which they came out here, and it couldn't have been more difficult breaking the prairie and building these communities and putting up barns and starting farms. I don't remember anyone when I was a kid in which we all put our shoulder to whatever the wheel happened to be in front of us saying, are you a conservative, or are you a liberal, or are you a Tea Party member? We all kind of knew where everyone stood, but when it came to common cause, everybody was willing to step forward on that. And I think that we have to recapture that in some fashion.
You know, I just gave a speech a couple of weeks ago to a big healthcare group. And there were people there from big health insurance companies running big healthcare networks and small healthcare networks. And there were doctors, or all these people in healthcare. And a lot of them were, I'd known a lot of them for years. And I didn't know what the division was, but there were plenty of Republicans and a few Democrats there. But to the person, after I spoke, I said I thought it'd be a disaster to repeal this health care law because we'd have to go back to square one, and we'd have to come up with 60 votes to break a filibuster. And right now there was an incentive to cooperate. What was the first bill passed in health care after the president signed the bill? Overwhelming bipartisan majority to clean up the small business reporting requirements, which were screwed up. Why? Because once there was a bill and a process, there was an incentive to cooperate. So all these health insurers and healthcare providers came to me and said, boy, we really agree with that. You know, we really think we're making progress now. We're being forced to rethink the delivery system, which, as I explained to you, is where half the money is that we spend we wouldn't spend in any other country. That's what we have to do. We have to create a system in Washington where we say to a guy like Speaker Boehner, who I think would make a deal, you know, if he didn't think he was going to be deposed, that nobody's going to be right about all these specifics. We are living in a complex world. What drives progress is direction. And what people are afraid about America now is that we don't have direction because we're going to be paralyzed. You can see it more clearly in other countries. How many articles have you and I read about the Tahrir Square, the aftermath of the Arab Spring in Egypt, and now the Muslim Brotherhood wins all the elections and the Salafis are the second biggest party? Why? Because they've been organized and they go to voters that weren't part of the Arab Spring, who don't understand the need for religious and cultural and intellectual diversity, and the magnets can pull the middle apart. So we need a magnet in the middle, and it is the process. It is the idea that a compromise is an honorable thing, and diversity of opinion actually only works for a society when you bring it into a process with people who do differ with you, because you know something they don't, you've had experiences they haven't, and if you actually have to work through these things and say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, you wind up with a product that gives you the right direction. That's the most important thing, and we got to do it on this debt. I'm telling you, if we don't deal with it, we will, sooner or later, someday or another, although we're dragging it out too much to suit me, have growth come back here, and interest rates will go up so fast you won't be able to catch your breath, and then everybody will say, why didn't we do this earlier? So we should have a considered plan now, but all of you have to make compromise honorable.
Mr. President, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.